On my wedding day, my mother-in-law held the microphone in front of 300 elite guests and called me a charity case from the slums. My husband just stood there sipping his champagne and told me to smile for his wealthy investors. So I took the microphone, looked at every single guest, and made an announcement that shattered their entire fake empire. Minutes later, the very same people who insulted me were literally hiding under the banquet tables while federal agents stormed our reception. I am Caroline, 33 years old, and until that exact moment, my husband Bradley thought he was marrying a naive, broke woman he could easily manipulate. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic people who underestimated your worth. The ballroom at the Aspen Resort was the absolute definition of luxury. 300 of the most elite members of American high society filled the room, their voices creating a steady, affluent hum. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, glittering glow over banquet tables draped in imported silk. Towering centerpieces of white orchids and hydrangeas scented the air, while waiters in crisp black suits moved silently through the crowd, constantly pouring vintage champagne. It was a $200,000 wedding, specifically designed to impress Bradley's supposed financial partners and elevate his family's already inflated social status. Bradley, at 35 years old, looked the exact part of the successful investment director in his tailored tuxedo. His parents, Patricia and Richard, had spent the entire evening aggressively working the room, making sure every single guest knew how incredibly generous they were for hosting such an extravagant event. I stood next to Bradley near the sweetheart table, holding my bouquet, my heart beating a steady rhythm against my ribs. I knew my mother-in-law deeply disliked me, but I had expected her to at least maintain the illusion of grace for the sake of her wealthy friends. I was completely wrong. The sharp clinking of a silver spoon against crystal cut through the room. Patricia stood at the main stage adjusting her heavy diamond necklace before grasping the microphone. She wore a silver couture gown that probably cost more than a down payment on a typical house, and her face was set in a practiced, picture-perfect smile. Patricia cleared her throat, ensuring every eye in the room was fixed firmly on her. She began her toast with a sweet, syrupy voice that completely masked the venom underneath. "We are so thrilled to welcome you all tonight," she announced. "As many of you know, our family has a long, proud tradition of excellence and pedigree. We hold our standards very high." She paused, letting her gaze drift over the crowd before locking eyes directly with me. Her smile widened, but her eyes were ice cold. "And while Bradley chose a bride who does not quite share our background, we have always believed in giving back. It is truly a testament to our family's deep capacity for charity that we welcome a girl who struggled her way up from the slums. Even though she clearly does not belong in our world, we are willing to open our hearts and provide her with a life she could only ever dream of." The ballroom went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpeted floor. The string quartet in the corner completely stopped playing. Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging shocked glances. A few people actually gasped, clearly appalled by the blatant disrespect being broadcast over the sound system. I looked over at the family table. My sister-in-law Monica, a 30-year-old woman who still lived entirely off her parents' credit cards, was sitting there openly smirking. Next to her sat her husband, Jamal. Jamal was a 34-year-old African-American tech entrepreneur who always wore $5,000 bespoke suits and acted like he owned the entire world. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his whiskey, looking highly entertained by my public humiliation. I turned my head to look at the man I had just married. I expected Bradley to step forward. I expected him to defend his wife, to take the microphone from his mother, or at the very least, to show a single shred of anger. Instead, Bradley just stood there completely unfazed. He took a slow sip of his champagne, actively refusing to meet my eyes. When he felt my stare, he aggressively nudged my arm with his elbow. He leaned in close, his breath warm against my ear, but his words were absolutely freezing. "Do not make that miserable face," Bradley whispered harshly. "Mom is just making a joke. Smile, Caroline." Every single one of my VIP partners is watching us right now. Do not ruin this night for my family. In that exact second, the illusion of my entire relationship shattered completely. For the past 2 years, Bradley had played the role of the loving, protective partner. He told me he did not care that I wore simple clothes or drove an older car. He told me his family was just a bit old-fashioned and that they would eventually come around. But looking at him now, standing by silently while his mother publicly stripped away my dignity, I realized he was nothing but a coward. He was a man who only cared about keeping up appearances for his high society friends. He was absolutely fine with me being treated like garbage as long as it kept his mother happy and his investors impressed. What Bradley and his entire arrogant family did not know was that I was not a charity case. I was not some helpless office worker who needed their rescue. I had spent the last decade building a massive real estate empire from the ground up. I intentionally lived a modest lifestyle because I valued privacy and authenticity over flashy displays of wealth. I wanted a husband who loved me for me, not for my bank accounts. But right now, standing in this ballroom listening to Patricia boast about funding this wedding, the irony was almost too much to bear. The silence in the room stretched on heavy and suffocating. Patricia stood on the stage, soaking in the attention, looking immensely proud of her cruel little speech. She truly believed she had put me in my place. She believed I would just lower my head, cry silently, and accept my role as the grateful, submissive outsider. I took a deep breath and let go of Bradley's arm. I did not cry. I did not run out of the room in tears. Instead, I straightened my posture and handed my bridal bouquet to a very confused waiter standing nearby. I smoothed down the front of my wedding dress, pasted a radiant, completely unbothered smile on my face, and started walking purposefully toward the main stage. It was time to introduce them to the real Caroline. Every step I took on the plush carpet felt deliberate and heavy. The sea of wealthy guests parted for me, their eyes wide with morbid fascination. They expected a weeping bride. They expected a broken woman fleeing to the restroom to hide her shame. Instead, I kept my shoulders pulled back and my chin held high. The heavy silence in the ballroom was deafening, broken only by the rustle of my silk gown as I marched toward the people who thought they could break me. Patricia watched me approach, and for a split second her perfect Botox smile faltered. But her arrogance quickly overrode her panic. She gripped the microphone tighter and leaned back into it, determined to finish her public execution before I could reach her. "Oh, look at her!" Patricia cooed into the speakers, her voice dripping with fake pity and vicious delight. "Our blushing bride is coming up to the stage. I suppose where you grew up in those cramped, rundown neighborhoods, interrupting a host is considered perfectly acceptable behavior. We are just so glad we could finally rescue you from that life of absolute mediocrity. You really should be thanking us for pulling you out of the slums." A sharp, cruel laugh echoed from the family table. It was Monica. She sat there in her emerald green bridesmaid dress, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at me. "She probably wants to take the microphone to thank us for the free meal," Monica sneered loudly, ensuring the surrounding tables of elite guests could hear her clearly. "It must be the best food she has ever tasted in her entire miserable life." Richard slammed his heavy fist onto the dining table. The expensive crystal wine glasses rattled violently, spilling water onto the white linen. His face turned a deep shade of crimson as he stood up, pointing aggressively at me. "Caroline, sit down immediately. You are making a spectacle of this family. Do not force me to embarrass you further in front of my business partners. Go back to your seat and keep your mouth shut." I glanced back at Bradley one last time. He was looking at the floor, casually adjusting his cufflinks, completely ignoring the fact that his parents and his sister were verbally assaulting his wife in front of 300 people. His cowardice was staggering. He was perfectly content to let me be the sacrificial lamb to protect his family pride. I reached the stage and climbed the 3 short steps. Patricia glared at me, her eyes flashing with pure hatred. She tried to pull the microphone away, clutching it tightly against her chest. But I reached out and wrapped my hand around the cool metal of the handle. I did not yank or struggle. I simply gripped it with a firm, unyielding pressure and stared directly into her eyes. My expression was so completely devoid of fear that she blinked, her confidence wavering. Slowly, nervously, she loosened her grip and let me take it. Monica saw her mother losing control of the situation and snapped. She grabbed a full glass of red wine from the nearest table and stormed up the stage steps. Her heels clicked sharply against the wooden floorboards, her face contorted with rage and entitlement. "Who do you think you are, you ungrateful gold digger?" Monica shrieked. Without a second of hesitation, she hurled the dark red wine directly at my chest. The cold liquid splashed violently across the bodice of my pure white silk wedding gown. The dark red stain rapidly soaked into the expensive fabric, dripping down the intricate lace and pooling on the polished floor beneath my feet. A collective gasp ripped through the ballroom. Several guests jumped up from their seats in shock. The whispers escalated into a chaotic murmur. But I did not scream. I did not flinch. I simply looked down at the crimson stain ruining my dress, casually brushed a drop of wine from my collarbone, and looked back at Monica with absolute boredom. Monica crossed her arms and smirked, immensely proud of herself. "Do not ruin the $200,000 wedding my parents generously paid for," she hissed at me. "You are nothing but a charity project. You owe us everything." That was when Jamal decided to join the fray. He strutted up to the stage to back up his wife, adjusting the lapels of his $5,000 bespoke suit. He stood tall, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me. As a tech CEO, Jamal was used to pushing people around in boardrooms, and he clearly thought I would cower under his authority. "Listen to me very carefully, Caroline." Jamal said, his voice deep and dripping with absolute condescension. "You are just a low-level desk worker. You do not understand how things operate up here. The elite have rules. We operate on a completely different level of society. You should be down on your knees thanking Bradley for giving you a last name that actually means something. You hit the jackpot with this family, and you are throwing it away by acting like trash." Jamal took a step closer, pointing a finger directly at my face. "Step down right now before I have my personal security team physically throw you out of your own reception. We are done playing nice with you." I held the microphone in my hand. The weight of it felt perfect. I looked at Jamal, then at Monica, then at Patricia and Richard standing below the stage. The entire ballroom was holding its collective breath, waiting for my breaking point. They all thought they had successfully broken me. They thought the poor girl from the slums was finally going to run away and hide. I raised the microphone to my lips. My voice echoed crystal clear through the massive sound system, completely calm and undeniably steady. "You are absolutely right, Jamal," I said, projecting my voice to every corner of the room. "The elite certainly do have rules, and a $200,000 wedding is quite an impressive expense." I turned my gaze directly to my mother-in-law, watching the color slowly begin to drain from her face. "So, Patricia, I have a quick question for you. Which credit card did you use to pay the deposit for this beautiful ballroom? Because the resort financial department just notified me that all 4 of your family black cards were declined for insufficient funds." The collective gasp that swept through the ballroom was louder than the string quartet had been all evening. Patricia's face turned a violent shade of white. She looked wildly around the room, her eyes darting between the elite guests, who were now leaning in, whispering fiercely to one another. "Cut the sound!" Patricia shrieked, abandoning all pretense of high society elegance. She waved her arms frantically at the back of the room. "Manager, get out here and cut her microphone immediately. Security, remove this lying lunatic from the stage." Mr. Bennett, the head resort manager, marched briskly down the center aisle. Patricia pointed a triumphant finger at him. "Take that microphone from her and throw her out onto the street," Patricia commanded. But Mr. Bennett did not look at Patricia. He walked right past her, climbed the stage steps, and stopped directly in front of me. To the absolute horror of my in-laws, he bowed deeply. "I apologize for the interruption, Madam Chairman." Mr. Bennett announced, his voice carrying clearly to the front rows. "I have locked your microphone to the main speakers. No one can cut your audio." Patricia staggered backward as if she had been physically struck. "Madam Chairman," she stammered, her voice shaking. "What are you talking about? She is a low-level desk clerk." I smiled, adjusting the microphone in my hand. "That is what you assumed, Patricia. Because you were too arrogant to ever ask what I actually do for a living. You saw a woman who preferred simple clothes and did not flaunt designer bags, and you decided I was a charity case beneath your pedigree. You told everyone you were saving me. I paced slowly across the stage, letting my wine-stained dress trail behind me like a battle flag. The truth is, I am the majority shareholder of the real estate conglomerate that owns this five-star Aspen resort. And I am the one who quietly approved the booking for this event when your financial background check raised massive red flags. Richard grabbed the edge of the banquet table, looking like he might collapse. Monica covered her mouth, her eyes darting to Jamal, who suddenly looked very uncomfortable in his custom suit. You see, I continued making eye contact with the wealthiest investors in the room. This entire wedding was a scam. The $200,000 bill for tonight has not been paid. In fact, this so-called elite family has not paid a single legitimate bill in nearly a year. They have been entirely bankrupt for 8 months. The ballroom erupted. The VIP guests, many of whom were clearly creditors or business partners of Richard and Bradley, stood up from their tables. The whispers turned into angry demands for answers. "She is having a mental breakdown," a voice shouted from the back. Bradley was sprinting down the aisle, his face slick with sweat. He shoved past his parents and scrambled up the stage steps, desperate to salvage his crumbling facade. "Do not listen to her. The wedding stress has made her completely delusional." He lunged toward me, his hands grasping for the microphone. "Give me that right now, Caroline," he hissed under his breath. "You are destroying my entire life. Stop acting crazy and shut up." I effortlessly sidestepped his grasping hands. He stumbled, barely catching his balance. I looked at him with absolute disgust. "You do not get to call me crazy to hide your crimes, Bradley. Your fake empire is over." I raised my free hand and tapped the microphone handle twice. It was a pre-arranged signal with my technical team in the sound booth. Instantly, the massive LED screen behind us, which had been looping our romantic engagement photos all evening, went pitch black. The sudden darkness drew every eye in the room to the stage. A second later, the screen flared back to life in stunning high resolution. But it was no longer showing photos of smiling couples. It was displaying highly classified financial audits, bank statements, and massive columns of red ink. "Let us look at the real charity cases in this room," I announced, gesturing to the giant screen. "Here we have the corporate accounts for Richard's investment firm. As you can clearly see, their liabilities have exceeded their assets since last November. They have been running a shell game, borrowing money from new investors to pay off the old ones." Several men in expensive tuxedos at the front tables pulled out their phones, snapping photos of the screen. I recognized them as Bradley's supposedly loyal partners. They looked furious. Bradley fell to his knees on the stage. He tried to pull the power cord from the LED screen, but it was safely secured behind a reinforced panel. "Turn it off," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "Caroline, please, they are going to kill me." I ignored him and clicked a small remote in my palm. The slide transitioned. "But the bankruptcy is just the tip of the iceberg," I continued, projecting my voice over the rising chaos in the room. "Because Richard's gambling debts were about to drag the entire family into prison. That is when Bradley decided he needed a wealthy bride to bail them out." I clicked to the next slide. High-resolution images of wire transfers appeared, complete with routing numbers, dates, and digital signatures. "You told me you loved me, Bradley, but you only proposed after you secretly paid a private investigator to look into my background and discovered I was the sole beneficiary of a massive private trust. You thought I was stupid. You thought you could just marry the poor girl from the slums and quietly drain her accounts." I pointed to a specific transaction highlighted in bright yellow on the screen. "Just 3 days ago, Bradley forged my signature on a transfer authorization. He moved $4.5 million out of my private trust. But he did not put it into his own accounts. He was smarter than that. He needed it washed first." I clicked the remote one final time. The screen displayed the recipient of the stolen millions. The company name flashed in giant, undeniable letters. It was Jamal's tech startup. Every head in the room snapped toward Jamal. The arrogant tech CEO who had just threatened to have security throw me out was now sweating profusely. His confident posture vanished instantly. "That is a lie," Jamal shouted, his voice cracking. He backed away from his own table, throwing his hands up defensively. I did not know where that money came from. Bradley told me it was legitimate venture capital funding. Monica turned on her husband like a rabid animal. "You idiot," she shrieked, shoving Jamal hard in the chest. "You told me your company was generating revenue. You dragged us into a felony." "Me," Jamal yelled back, his face contorted in panic. "Your brother is the one who set me up. He used my servers to hide your father's dirty money." The family alliance completely shattered right there on the ballroom floor. Patricia was screaming at Richard, hitting his arm and crying that he had ruined their reputation. Monica and Jamal were locked in a vicious screaming match, throwing each other under the bus as loudly as possible. I stood on the stage and simply watched them destroy themselves. The elite guests did not intervene. Instead, they pulled out their smartphones, recording every humiliating second of the family's spectacular downfall. Bradley finally realized that the crowd was no longer an audience of wealthy peers he could impress. They were witnesses to his federal crimes. Stripped of his arrogance and cornered by the undeniable truth blazing on the giant screen behind me, he broke completely. He crawled forward on his hands and knees across the polished wooden stage. Reaching out with trembling hands, he grabbed the wine-stained silk of my wedding dress, clutching it like a lifeline. Tears streamed down his face, ruining his perfectly groomed appearance. "Caroline, please." Bradley wept, his voice cracking loudly over the microphone that I still held. "We are married. You cannot do this to me. I love you. I swear I love you. We can fix this. Just turn off the screen. Tell everyone it is a misunderstanding. Please, Caroline, do not send my family to prison. I will pay back every single cent. Just give me another chance." He was using the very concept of love as a bargaining chip, proving exactly how pathetic and manipulative he truly was. I looked down at the man I had promised to spend my life with just a few hours ago. I did not feel an ounce of heartbreak. I only felt an overwhelming sense of liberation. "You do not love me, Bradley," I said, my voice echoing coldly through the silent ballroom. "You love the money you thought you were stealing. You love the idea of a naive girl from the slums who would sit quietly while your family treated her like garbage. But that girl does not exist." I gestured to Mr. Bennett, the resort manager, who had remained standing respectfully near the edge of the stage. He stepped forward immediately and handed me a sleek black leather folder. I opened the folder and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. I looked Bradley dead in the eye and dropped the papers directly onto his chest. He scrambled frantically to catch them before they hit the floor. "Those are your divorce papers, Bradley," I announced. "And right behind them is a federal injunction signed by a judge. It legally freezes every single asset tied to your name, your father's fraudulent investment firm, and Jamal's fake tech startup. You do not have a single dime left to your name." Bradley stared at the papers in sheer terror, his mouth opening and closing without making a sound. But I was not finished. I brought the microphone back to my lips for my final announcement. "I did not just show these financial slides to our guests tonight," I declared, ensuring every person in the room heard me clearly. "I submitted the full forensic audit, including your forged wire transfers, to the Federal Bureau of Investigation at 6 o'clock this morning." The color entirely drained from Bradley's face. He dropped the legal papers, his hands shaking violently. Right on cue, the piercing wail of police sirens shattered the quiet mountain air outside. The sound grew louder and more intense by the second. Suddenly, brilliant flashes of red and blue lights pierced through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the ballroom, painting the panicked faces of my in-laws in harsh, flashing colors. Total chaos erupted. The elite guests, desperate to avoid being associated with a federal raid, backed away from the family table, clearing a wide path toward the entrance. The heavy double doors of the ballroom burst open with a deafening crash. A dozen federal agents, wearing dark tactical windbreakers, marched inside, their badges gleaming under the crystal chandeliers. "Federal agents, nobody move the lead!" Officer shouted, his voice cutting through the panic. "We have federal warrants for the arrest of Richard Patricia Bradley and Monica, along with Jamal, for wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy." Patricia let out a blood-curdling shriek. Her high society facade was completely annihilated. Richard tried to bolt toward the kitchen service doors, but two agents instantly intercepted him, slamming him against the wall and snapping handcuffs tightly around his wrists. Then came the ultimate, pathetic display of cowardice. Stripped of all their elite dignity, terrified of the handcuffs and the flashing cell phone cameras of their former friends, Patricia, Monica, and Jamal literally scrambled to the floor. They crawled frantically under the main banquet table, dragging the expensive floral centerpieces down with them. They pulled the thick white silk tablecloths over their heads, hiding in the dark under the table like terrified children. The wealthy VIP guests crowded around, holding their phones high to record the absolute humiliation. They captured the moment the federal agents surrounded the banquet table, lifted the expensive linen, and dragged Patricia and Monica out by their arms. Monica was sobbing hysterically, her emerald dress tangled around her knees, while Patricia screamed about her rights and her social standing to anyone who would listen. Jamal was hauled up next to them, his $5,000 bespoke suit ruined, his head hung low in absolute shame. On the stage, two agents flanked Bradley. They yanked him to his feet and roughly secured his hands behind his back. He did not look at me again. He just kept his eyes glued to the floor, completely broken. I stood on the stage and watched the people who had insulted, degraded, and tried to rob me get paraded out of the ballroom in handcuffs. I did not feel a shred of pity. They had earned every single second of this nightmare. I slowly slid the heavy diamond engagement ring off my finger. I tossed it onto the wooden stage, letting it bounce away into the shadows. Mr. Bennett stepped up beside me. He held a luxurious, tailored cashmere coat and gently draped it over my shoulders, covering the red wine stain on my silk gown. "Your limousine is waiting outside, Madam Chairman," he said respectfully. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett," I replied. With my head held high and my posture perfect, I walked gracefully down the stage steps and strode down the center aisle. The remaining guests parted from me, watching in stunned silence as I walked away. I did not look back at the screaming, the handcuffs, or the flashing cameras. I stepped out into the crisp mountain air, slid into the back of my waiting car, and left the ruins of their fake empire far behind me. Family is not defined by blood, and it certainly does not give anyone the right to manipulate and steal from you. Never allow anyone to trample over your boundaries because they think you are weak. And if they ever try, make absolutely sure that the price they pay is something they can never ever afford. The silence in the ballroom was absolute after Richard slammed his heavy fist onto the table. The expensive crystal wine glasses rattled violently, spilling water onto the white linen. His face turned a deep shade of crimson as he stood up, pointing aggressively at me. He demanded I sit down immediately and stop making a spectacle of the family. He tried to exert his patriarchal dominance, treating me like an unruly employee who had stepped out of line. He ordered me to go back to my seat and keep my mouth shut. I completely ignored his command. I stood firmly on the stage and tapped the microphone handle with my index finger. A sharp, clear thump echoed through the massive sound system, verifying it was perfectly live. The tension in the room skyrocketed. The elite guests shifted in their seats, their eyes darting between my unwavering stance and Richard's furious red face. They realized I was not backing down. The poor girl from the slums was refusing to submit to the wealthy patriarch. That was when Monica decided she had to intervene. She could not stand watching her parents lose control of the narrative. She sat at the family table, her face contorted with absolute entitlement. She grabbed a full glass of dark red wine from the table, her knuckles white, as she gripped the crystal stem. With a dramatic huff, she pushed her chair back and stormed toward the stage. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished wooden floorboards. She marched up the stage steps with her head held high, projecting the image of a protective sister defending her family's honor. As she reached the top step right next to where I stood holding the microphone, she feigned a sudden stumble. It was a terrible, exaggerated piece of acting. With a sharp gasp, she thrust her arm forward aggressively, splashing the entire contents of her wineglass directly onto my chest. The cold liquid hit me forcefully. It splashed violently across the bodice of my pure white silk wedding gown. The dark red stain rapidly soaked into the expensive fabric, dripping down the intricate lace and pooling on the stage floor beneath my feet. A collective gasp ripped through the ballroom. Several guests jumped up from their seats in shock. The whispers escalated into a chaotic murmur. But I did not scream. I did not flinch or burst into tears. I stood my ground, my posture perfect, the microphone still held firmly in my hand. Monica leaned in close to me. She made sure she was completely off the microphone, her face just inches from mine. The fake look of clumsiness vanished instantly, replaced by a vicious, triumphant sneer. "Who do you think you are, you ungrateful gold digger?" Monica hissed under her breath, her voice dripping with venom. "You think you can stand up here and embarrass us? You are nothing. We gave you everything. Do not ruin the $200,000 wedding my parents generously paid for. You are just a charity project. You owe us your entire miserable life." She crossed her arms, immensely proud of herself. She expected me to run away crying. She expected the sheer humiliation of a ruined wedding dress to finally break my spirit. She wanted the elite crowd to see the poor outsider running out of the room in disgrace. Instead of giving her the satisfaction of a reaction, I simply looked down at the massive crimson stain ruining my dress. I casually brushed a stray drop of wine from my collarbone with 2 fingers. I looked back up at Monica with absolute boredom. My expression was so completely devoid of fear or shame that her triumphant smirk faltered. She blinked, her confidence wavering for the first time all evening. I did not raise a hand to her. I did not yell back. I just held her gaze with a chilling, silent authority. The contrast between her erratic emotional attack and my cold, calculated composure made her look exactly like the spoiled, insecure child she truly was. She took a small step backward, suddenly realizing that throwing wine on me had not worked. It had only solidified my resolve. The trap was set, and the Golden family was walking right into it. Seeing his wife falter, Jamal decided it was time to intervene. He pushed his chair back from the front table, the harsh scraping sound echoing across the tense ballroom. Jamal was a 34-year-old tech entrepreneur, an African-American man who prided himself on projecting an image of absolute dominance and corporate superiority. He was determined to save his wife from looking foolish and to reassert the family's perceived authority over me. He adjusted the lapels of his $5,000 bespoke charcoal gray suit. Every single inch of him was meticulously styled to scream wealth and power, from the heavy gold luxury watch gleaming on his left wrist to the custom silk tie perfectly knotted at his collar. He strutted up the wooden steps of the stage with supreme arrogance, placing a protective hand on Monica's waist and gently nudging her behind him. He was stepping up to play the role of the corporate shark, the intimidating enforcer of the family's elite status. Jamal invaded my personal space, stepping so uncomfortably close that I could smell his overpowering expensive cologne mixing heavily with the sharp, acidic scent of the red wine soaking into my dress. He looked down at me, attempting to use his height and broad shoulders to make me cower in fear. In his mind, I was just a fragile, low-wage worker who had finally cracked under the immense pressure of high society. He thought I was an easy target. "You really overplayed your hand this time," Caroline Jamal said. His voice was a low, rumbling baritone, intentionally pitched to sound menacing, but kept just quiet enough so the microphone in my hand would not pick it up. "Did you honestly think you could stand up here and throw a tantrum without facing severe consequences?" I did not back away. I kept my feet firmly planted on the floorboards, holding the microphone securely against my side. I simply watched him, studying his aggressive posturing like a scientist observing an unpredictable insect. Jamal smirked, a condescending, arrogant expression that perfectly mirrored his wife's previous look of triumph. "You see, this is the exact problem with letting people from your background into our inner circles. You simply do not understand the rules of the elite. You think your little emotional outbursts mean something up here. They do not. In our world, respect is not demanded by throwing a fit. Power up here is inherited and bought. You have absolutely neither." He gestured dismissively toward my ruined, wine-soaked wedding gown. "You are just a low-level desk worker. A nobody who got incredibly lucky." Bradley reached down into the dirt and gave you a last name that actually commands respect in boardrooms. He gave you a golden ticket out of your pathetic, mediocre life. You should be on your knees right now begging his parents for their forgiveness. You should be thanking this family for even allowing you to breathe the same air as the people sitting in this room. I listened to his condescending lecture with a perfectly blank expression. Internally, I found his entire speech absolutely hilarious. Here was a man wearing a suit paid for with stolen funds, lecturing a hidden real estate tycoon about the rules of wealth and power. But I kept my face entirely stoic, letting him dig his own grave deeper with every arrogant word. "We are done playing nice with you," Jamal continued, his tone hardening into a direct physical threat. He pointed a finger right at my face, jabbing the air just inches from my nose. "I have my personal security team stationed at the main double doors of this ballroom. I pay them extremely well to handle the garbage that sneaks into my corporate events. Do not make me signal them." He leaned in even closer, his eyes narrowing into cold, calculating slits. "Step down from this stage right now. Walk out the back service exit where you belong. If you leave quietly, maybe Bradley will let you keep that cheap engagement ring as a severance package. But if you speak one more word into that microphone, I will have my men physically drag you out of your own reception and toss you onto the street. Do you understand me?" The silence that followed his threat was heavy and suffocating. The wealthy guests in the front rows, the elite investors and business partners were watching us with bated breath. They could not hear Jamal's whispered threats, but they could clearly see the aggressive, domineering posturing. They saw a powerful tech CEO backing a defenseless bride into a corner. They were waiting to see if the poor outsider would finally break down, drop the microphone, and run away in shame. I looked at the finger Jamal had pointed aggressively at my face. Then I slowly raised my gaze to meet his eyes. I did not blink. I did not tremble. I did not show a single ounce of fear, panic, or intimidation. I had sat across negotiation tables from ruthless billionaires. I had personally dismantled hostile corporate takeovers engineered by men with 10 times his power and 100 times his intellect. Jamal was not a titan of industry. He was just a small, arrogant boy playing dress-up with money he did not earn. My completely unfazed reaction threw him entirely off balance. The confident, predatory smirk slowly began to fade from his face. He expected me to shatter under his verbal assault. He expected total submission. Instead, he found himself staring directly into the eyes of a woman who looked like she was calculating the exact cost of buying his entire tech company and selling it for scrap parts. I raised the microphone slowly toward my lips, never breaking eye contact with him. The harsh metallic hum of the live audio system echoed across the cavernous ballroom. Jamal took a fraction of a step back as the feedback whined, his broad shoulders tensing under his custom suit. He expected me to drop the microphone. He expected me to surrender to his whispered threats and run out the back service doors. Instead, my voice rang out through the speakers, clear, resonant, and completely devoid of fear. "You are absolutely right, Jamal," I said. The sound of my voice washed over the crowd, instantly silencing the remaining whispers in the back of the room. "The elite do have rules. You operate on a completely different level of society. You rely on power, on leverage, and on keeping people in their designated places." Jamal's eyes widened. He darted a quick, nervous glance over his shoulder at the tables filled with his tech investors and Bradley's financial partners. He had intended for our conversation to be a private threat, an intimidation tactic delivered off the microphone. Broadcasting his arrogant philosophy to the entire room was not part of his strategy. "But here is the fascinating thing about your rules, Jamal." I continued pacing slowly across the stage. I stepped around Monica, who had frozen entirely, her empty wine glass still clutched in her shaking hand. "Those rules only apply if you actually possess the wealth you so desperately love to flaunt. Power up here is inherited and bought." Those were your exact words. But what happens when the money runs out? I turned my attention away from the panicked tech executive and locked my gaze directly on my mother-in-law. Patricia was standing rigid at the base of the stage steps. The smug satisfaction she had worn while delivering her cruel toast had completely evaporated, replaced by a tight, frantic confusion. She looked like a woman who had just realized she stepped on a landmine and was waiting for the inevitable blast. "Patricia," I announced, letting her name bounce off the crystal chandeliers. "You stood on this stage 10 minutes ago and demanded that I show gratitude. You demanded that I bow down and thank this family for rescuing me from the slums. You made sure every single guest in this ballroom knew that you were generously footing the bill for a $200,000 wedding reception." I stopped at the edge of the stage, looking down at her. The heavy silence in the room was almost suffocating. The elite guests, men and women adorned in diamonds and imported tuxedos, leaned forward in their seats. They were no longer watching a petty family squabble. They were watching a public financial reckoning. "It is a beautiful reception," I stated, gesturing elegantly with my free hand toward the towering white orchids and the overflowing champagne towers. "The catering is flawless. The imported silk tablecloths are a lovely touch. I am sure everyone here is incredibly impressed by your deep capacity for charity and your boundless wealth. But I have a very simple practical question for you, Patricia." I gripped the microphone tightly, my voice dropping an octave, slicing through the tension like a steel blade. "Which credit card did you use to pay the deposit for this beautiful ballroom?" Patricia flinched, as if I had struck her across the face. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her manicured hands gripped the edge of the nearest guest table so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Because the resort financial department just notified the front desk of a rather embarrassing administrative issue." I continued, my tone conversational, yet utterly ruthless. "It seems that when they attempted to run the final authorization for tonight's event, the transaction was declined. So they tried a backup card, and then another, and then a fourth." Richard, who had been looming behind his wife, suddenly lunged forward. "Caroline, shut your mouth this instant," he roared, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "This is an internal banking error. You have no idea what you are talking about." "I know exactly what I am talking about, Richard." I fired back over the speakers, my voice easily overpowering his unamplified shouting. "All 4 of your prestigious family black cards were declined for insufficient funds. Every single one of them. The cards are maxed out, frozen, and completely useless." The reaction was instantaneous. The pristine silence of the ballroom shattered into a chaotic symphony of shocked gasps, aggressive whispers, and the scraping of chairs. This was not just a rumor being passed around a country club locker room. This was a live execution of their financial standing. I looked out at the front tables. The VIP guests, the people Bradley and Richard relied on to maintain their fraudulent investment firm, were exchanging dark, furious looks. A prominent venture capitalist sitting in the second row abruptly set his champagne flute down on the table, his face hardening as he leaned over to whisper something urgent to his business partner. The facade of the Golden family was cracking wide open right in front of the people they needed most to deceive. "You are standing here in $5,000 suits and couture gowns bragging about your superiority," I announced, making sure my voice carried over the rising murmurs of the crowd. "You poured a glass of red wine on my wedding dress because you thought I was a gold digger trying to steal your family fortune. But the reality is that your family does not have a fortune to steal. You do not even have enough liquidity to pay for the floral arrangements sitting on these tables." Patricia covered her face with her hands, letting out a stifled, humiliated sob. She shrank back against Richard, trying to hide from the burning stares of her high society peers. Her entire identity, built meticulously over decades of social climbing and elitist posturing, was disintegrating under the bright ballroom lights. Jamal, standing a few feet away from me on the stage, looked absolutely nauseated. He aggressively tugged at his custom silk tie as if it were suddenly choking him. He darted a panicked look at the investors from his tech startup, who were sitting near the center aisle. They were glaring back at him with undisguised suspicion. The threat he had made just moments ago about calling his private security team now felt entirely pathetic. "You told me I owed you my life," I said, focusing my attention back on Monica, who was still frozen on the stage. "You told me I was a charity project. But right now, the only people in this room relying on charity to survive are you and your parents." The whispers among the VIP guests grew louder, morphing from quiet gossip into a low, threatening rumble of anger. The people in this room were not fools. They were apex predators in the financial world. They smelled blood in the water, and they were rapidly realizing that the blood belonged to Richard and Bradley. I stood on the stage, my wine-stained dress standing out as a symbol of their desperate cruelty. I had dropped the first domino, and the entire structure of their fake, glamorous life was already beginning to collapse. But I was not done. The declined credit cards were just the warm-up. It was time to show them what real power actually looked like. The immediate aftermath of my announcement was pure, unadulterated panic. Patricia realized with terrifying clarity that the wealthy peers she had spent her entire life trying to impress were now actively turning against her. The whispers from the front tables were no longer polite high society gossip. They were harsh, demanding questions. The venture capitalists and hedge fund managers were looking at Richard like a wounded animal. Patricia knew she had seconds to shut me down before the damage became permanent. She spun around frantically, her silk couture gown whipping around her ankles, searching the perimeter of the grand ballroom for anyone in a staff uniform. Her eyes locked onto a figure standing near the grand double doors. It was Mr. Bennett, the head resort manager. He was an older, distinguished man in an immaculate black tuxedo, overseeing the event with a team of security guards positioned behind him. "Cut the sound," Patricia shrieked. Her voice was shrill, completely stripped of its usual refined elegance. It echoed off the vaulted ceilings, desperate and ugly. "Mr. Bennett, get out here right now and cut her microphone immediately. Security, remove this lying lunatic from the stage." Richard scrambled to back up his wife. He turned to the VIP tables, holding up his hands in a placating gesture, sweating profusely under the crystal chandeliers. "Please, everyone, remain calm," Richard pleaded loudly, though his own voice was shaking. "It is a technical glitch. The resort made a billing error. My daughter-in-law is clearly having a severe mental breakdown from the stress of the wedding. We will have her removed so we can continue the evening." He glared at the back of the room and bellowed, "Manager, do your job. Turn off that audio system and throw her out onto the street before I sue this entire establishment." Mr. Bennett nodded curtly. He stepped away from the double doors and began marching briskly down the center aisle. 4 large, broad-shouldered security guards in dark suits followed closely in formation right behind him. At the family table, a wave of smug relief washed over the in-laws. Patricia crossed her arms over her chest, letting out a jagged breath. She threw a triumphant, venomous glare in my direction. Monica, who was still standing frozen on the stage near Jamal, finally found her voice. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "You are finished, Caroline," Monica sneered, stepping closer to her husband for protection. "You thought you could come up here and embarrass us. Now you are going to get dragged out the back door by security like the trash you actually are. Good luck walking back to the slums in a wine-stained dress." Jamal adjusted his tie, his arrogant smirk returning now that he believed physical force was arriving to handle me. Bradley, who had been completely paralyzed by the revelation of his family's declined credit cards, finally looked up from the floor. He stepped toward the edge of the stage, looking up at me with a mixture of anger and fake pity. "Just put the microphone down," Caroline Bradley ordered, trying to sound authoritative. "You have done enough damage. The manager is going to escort you out. If you walk away quietly right now, I promise I will not press charges for defamation. Do not make this harder than it has to be." I did not lower the microphone. I did not move a single inch. I stood perfectly still, watching Mr. Bennett close the distance between the back of the ballroom and the main stage. The heavy thud of the security team's footsteps echoed through the silent room. The wealthy guests pulled their chairs in, clearing the aisle, eagerly anticipating the dramatic physical removal of the rogue bride. Mr. Bennett reached the bottom of the stairs. Patricia stepped aside, gesturing grandly toward me as if she were a queen ordering an execution. "Take that from her hands," Patricia commanded him. Mr. Bennett did not even glance at Patricia. He walked right past her outstretched arm, completely ignoring her demands. He climbed the 3 wooden steps onto the stage, his black dress shoes clicking sharply. The 4 security guards fanned out at the base of the stairs, turning their backs to the stage and facing the guests, creating a human barricade between the family and me. Monica took a step back, suddenly confused as to why the security guards were not moving toward me. Jamal frowned, his eyes darting between the guards and the manager. Bradley opened his mouth to give Mr. Bennett a direct order. But Mr. Bennett walked straight past Bradley. He walked past Jamal. He walked past Monica. He stopped exactly 2 feet directly in front of me. The entire ballroom held its breath. They waited for him to reach out and snatch the microphone from my hands. They waited for the physical struggle. Instead, Mr. Bennett placed his right hand flat against his chest, right over his heart. He planted his feet together and executed a flawless, deep, and incredibly respectful bow. He held the bow for 3 full seconds, a display of absolute deference that sent a shockwave of pure confusion crashing over the room. When he finally straightened up, he looked at me with an expression of utmost professional respect. "I apologize for the interruption," Madam Chairman Mr. Bennett announced. His voice was projected loudly and clearly, carrying across the stage and reaching the front rows of the VIP tables without any need for amplification. "I have locked your microphone to the main speakers in the sound booth. No one can cut your audio. You have the floor for as long as you require." If a bomb had detonated in the center of the room, it would have caused less shock. The absolute paralysis that struck my in-laws was a masterpiece of human psychology. Patricia literally swayed on her feet, her hands reaching out blindly to grab the edge of the banquet table to keep from collapsing. The color drained from her face so completely she looked like a ghost. Richard's jaw dropped open, his eyes bulging out of his head as he stared at the resort manager in sheer terror. "Madam Chairman." Patricia stammered the words, barely squeaking out of her throat. Her voice was trembling so violently, she sounded like a different person. "What are you talking about? She is a low-level desk clerk. She is a nobody." Monica dropped her empty wine glass. It hit the wooden stage floor with a sharp crack, shattering into a dozen jagged pieces, but she did not even look down. Jamal looked like he had just swallowed glass. He took a terrified step backward, putting distance between himself and me, finally realizing that the woman he had just threatened with physical violence was the most powerful person in the building. Bradley stared at me, his eyes darting wildly between my calm face and Mr. Bennett's respectful posture. He was desperately trying to process the impossible reality unfolding in front of him. The quiet, frugal woman he thought he had successfully manipulated was being addressed with a title reserved for corporate titans. The elite investors in the audience immediately caught the shift in the power dynamic. They were not watching a crazy bride. They were watching an execution carried out by someone operating at the highest level of authority. I looked down at the shattered glass at Monica's feet, then raised my eyes to meet Patricia's terrified gaze. The microphone was live, the room was mine, and their ultimate nightmare had just begun. I adjusted my grip on the microphone. The cool metal felt grounding against my palm. I looked directly at my mother-in-law, who was still trembling near the shattered glass. "That is what you assumed, Patricia," I said, my voice echoing evenly across the vast space. "Because you were too arrogant to ever ask what I actually do for a living. You saw a woman who preferred simple clothes and did not flaunt designer bags, and you decided I was a charity case beneath your pedigree. You told everyone you were saving me." I paced slowly across the stage, letting my wine-stained dress trail behind me like a battle flag. I stepped carefully over the broken crystal, forcing Jamal and Monica to back away from me. "The truth is," I continued, my gaze sweeping over the audience, "I am the majority shareholder of the real estate conglomerate that owns this 5-star Aspen resort. And I am the one who quietly approved the booking for this event when your financial background check raised massive red flags." Richard grabbed the edge of the banquet table, looking like he might collapse entirely. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. Monica covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes darting to Jamal. Jamal suddenly looked incredibly small inside his expensive custom suit. The tech CEO, who had just threatened to throw me out, was now sweating profusely, realizing he was standing on my property surrounded by my security team. I turned my attention back to the crowd. "You see," I announced, making direct eye contact with the wealthiest investors sitting in the front rows, "this entire wedding was a scam. The $200,000 bill for tonight has not been paid. In fact, this so-called elite family has not paid a single legitimate bill in nearly a year. They have been entirely bankrupt for 8 months. The ballroom erupted. The VIP guests, many of whom were clearly creditors or business partners of Richard and Bradley, stood up from their tables. The whispers turned into angry, demanding questions. I watched a prominent hedge fund manager slam his napkin down and point an accusing finger at Richard. These were not just socialites attending a party. They were men and women who managed billions of dollars, and they instantly recognized the smell of financial rot. They realized they had been invited here not as honored guests, but as marks for a family desperately trying to project an illusion of solvency. Patricia let out a strangled gasp. She looked around at the furious faces of her peers, the people she had spent decades trying to impress. "Richard, do something," she hissed, grabbing her husband's arm. "Tell them she is lying. Tell them we are fine." But Richard could not speak. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving under his tuxedo jacket. The reality of his financial ruin was being broadcast live to the exact people he owed money to. I did not stop. I refused to give them a single second to recover. "You told me I owed you my life," I said, focusing my attention back on Monica. "You stood on this stage 5 minutes ago and called me a gold digger. You said your parents generously paid for this celebration. But the reality is that the only people in this room relying on charity to survive are you and your parents. Your father's firm is drowning in debt. Your mother's credit cards are frozen. The only reason this event was not canceled by the venue months ago is because I personally instructed Mr. Bennett to let it proceed. I wanted to see exactly how far you would all go to maintain your pathetic, glittering lie." The murmurs among the VIP guests grew into a low, threatening rumble of anger. Men in expensive tuxedos were pulling out their phones, likely messaging their financial advisors to pull whatever remaining capital they had tied up with Richard's firm. Women in couture gowns were staring at Patricia with absolute disgust. The social hierarchy of the room had inverted completely. The predators had suddenly realized they were sitting at a table with scavengers. "The very floor you are standing on, the crystal chandeliers above your heads, the luxury suites you booked for the weekend, I own all of it," I declared. My voice was steady, cutting through the rising panic in the room. "I did not marry into wealth tonight. I brought the wealth with me." Bradley finally found his voice. He took a shaky step toward me, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Caroline, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "You are destroying my family. We can talk about this. Just turn the microphone off. We can fix this in private. I will explain everything to you." I looked at the man I had married, the man who had stood by silently while his mother humiliated me, while his sister threw wine on me, and while his brother-in-law threatened me. He was not asking for forgiveness. He was asking for a cover-up. He wanted to drag me back into the shadows to protect his precious reputation. "There is nothing to fix in private, Bradley," I replied coldly. "You brought me out here in front of 300 people to play the role of your grateful, submissive little trophy. You let your mother call me trash because you thought I was too poor and too weak to fight back. You thought my silence was submission. It was not. It was just me taking notes." I turned back to the audience, my voice ringing out with absolute authority. "For 8 months, Richard and Bradley have been running a shell game. They have been borrowing money from new investors in this very room to pay off the old ones. They hosted this wedding to convince all of you that their firm is thriving, hoping you would write them another round of checks tomorrow morning." The outrage from the front tables boiled over. A man with silver hair and a sharp jawline shouted directly at Richard. "Is this true? Richard, have you been using our capital to fund your personal debts?" Richard shrank back, unable to meet the man's furious gaze. Patricia tried to hide behind her husband, her former arrogance replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. The wealthy elite did not tolerate being made into fools, and they certainly did not tolerate being robbed by their own. I stood on the stage, the undisputed owner of the room, both literally and figuratively. My wine-stained dress no longer looked like a mark of humiliation. It looked like the armor of someone who had just walked through a battlefield and emerged completely victorious. I had dropped the first major domino, and the entire structure of their fake glamorous life was rapidly collapsing into dust. But the bankruptcy was just the beginning. The real crimes had yet to be exposed. The real crimes had yet to be exposed. Bradley could no longer hide behind his parents or his cowardly silence. The terrifying realization that his entire livelihood was evaporating in front of his eyes finally snapped him out of his paralysis. He saw the furious expressions of his investors and knew that if he did not silence me immediately, he would be leaving this resort in handcuffs rather than a honeymoon suite. He lunged forward, sprinting down the short distance between the sweetheart table and the stage. His polished facade was entirely gone. He took the wooden steps two at a time, his breathing heavy, his eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic desperation. He reached up and violently loosened his expensive silk tie, as if the collar of his tuxedo shirt was suddenly choking him. He threw his hands up in a placating gesture toward the crowd, desperately trying to project the image of a loving, concerned husband managing a tragic situation. "Please, everyone, I beg of you to remain calm," Bradley shouted, forcing a laugh that sounded jagged and hysterical. "I apologize for this display. My beautiful bride has been under an immense amount of pressure lately. The stress of planning this massive event has clearly taken a severe toll on her mental health. She is not in her right mind tonight. These claims are nothing but the delusional ramblings of an exhausted woman who needs immediate medical attention. We will get her the help she requires." He was trying to gaslight me in front of 300 people. It was the ultimate classic maneuver of a cornered coward. Rather than face the consequences of his actions, he was trying to convince a room full of elite financial predators that the woman exposing his bankruptcy was simply insane. He figured if he played the role of the sympathetic, protective husband dealing with a hysterical wife, they might actually pity him and look the other way. The crowd, however, was not buying a single word of it. The venture capitalists in the front row crossed their arms, their eyes darting between my calm, dominant posture and Bradley's sweaty, frantic flailing. They had seen enough corporate collapses to recognize the stench of a drowning man trying to pull anyone else down with him. Seeing that his public announcement was failing to soothe the angry investors, Bradley turned his focus entirely on me. He stepped right into my personal space, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me exactly as his brother-in-law Jamal had tried and failed to do just minutes earlier. "Caroline, give me the microphone right now," Bradley hissed under his breath. He kept his back to the audience, leaning his face down close to mine. His voice was a harsh, venomous whisper. "You are completely out of your mind. You are acting crazy. Stop this right now before I have you committed to a psychiatric ward. Give me the mic and tell them you made a mistake. We can go to a hotel room and sort this out privately. I am your husband. You owe me your loyalty." He reached out his hand, darting forward to physically snatch the microphone from my grip. He expected me to freeze. He expected the obedient, quiet woman he thought he had married to finally submit to his aggressive command and let him take the weapon from her hands. He was dead wrong. With a fluid, effortless motion, I shifted my weight and smoothly sidestepped his grasping hand. I moved with the cold grace of someone who was entirely in control of her environment. Bradley, whose momentum was entirely focused on snatching the heavy metal microphone, stumbled forward awkwardly. He barely caught himself from tripping over the hem of my ruined silk gown, his polished dress shoes slipping slightly on the smooth wood of the stage. He looked absolutely ridiculous. He was a desperate, sweating fraud, trying to wrestle a piece of audio equipment away from a woman who was not even breaking a sweat. Down below the stage, Patricia let out a strangled sob of defeat, watching her golden boy fail to control the situation. "I am not having a mental breakdown, Bradley," I said, speaking directly into the microphone, so my voice boomed across the vast ballroom. "And I am certainly not acting crazy. In fact, I am the only person on this stage who has a perfectly clear understanding of reality. You cannot gaslight your way out of a financial audit." I turned to face the audience, completely ignoring my husband, who was now breathing heavily behind me. He was trying to figure out how to physically stop me without looking like a physical abuser on camera. Countless smartphones were already raised in the air, recording his every move. He was trapped. If he touched me, he would be arrested for assault before the night was over. "My husband wants you to believe that I am delusional," I announced to the captivated crowd. He wants you to believe that my claims about his family's insolvency are just the ramblings of a stressed bride. He is desperately hoping that if he calls me crazy enough times, you will all sit back down, drink your champagne, and ignore the fact that your investments have vanished into thin air. I looked over my shoulder at Bradley. His face was a mask of pure terror. He knew exactly what was coming next. He knew he had run out of lies and excuses, but I do not expect anyone in this room to simply take my word for it. I continued bringing my gaze back to the front tables. In the world of high finance, talk is cheap. You are all successful investors. You do not deal in rumors or emotional outbursts. You deal in hard data. You deal in verifiable facts. And luckily for you, I brought exactly that. I raised my free hand in the air. The massive LED screen positioned behind the stage had been softly illuminating the room all evening, looping high-resolution, heavily edited photos of our engagement. It showed Bradley and me smiling on a beach, laughing in a park, projecting the absolute perfect image of a happy, affluent couple. It was a visual representation of the lie he had sold me to get access to my wealth. I lowered my hand and sharply tapped the top of the microphone twice with my index finger. Instantly, the vibrant engagement photos vanished. The massive LED screen behind us suddenly went pitch black. The massive LED screen behind us suddenly went pitch black. The darkness lasted for exactly 3 seconds. It was just long enough for the uneasy silence to stretch to a breaking point before the display roared back to life. But it was no longer a montage of romantic smiles. A blindingly bright, high-resolution document illuminated the ballroom in stark white light. The 4,000-pixel clarity was unforgiving. It displayed a heavily redacted but completely verifiable forensic audit of Richard Investment Firm. I turned slightly to look at the screen, using my free hand to gesture toward the glowing numbers like a seasoned corporate presenter. Let us review the actual financial health of the Golden family, I announced, my voice slicing through the stifling quiet of the room. What you are looking at is the third quarter balance sheet for Richard Holding Company. If you look closely at column 4, you will notice a rather alarming trend. The liabilities do not just exceed the assets, they obliterate them. A collective intake of breath echoed from the front rows. Men who managed billions of dollars for a living leaned forward, their eyes scanning the towering columns of red ink. The numbers were catastrophic. Richard collapsed into the nearest empty chair at the family table. He clutched his chest, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. The reality of his absolute ruin was 50 feet wide and glowing above his head. Patricia was hyperventilating beside him. Her manicured hands gripped the edge of the tablecloth so hard her knuckles were bone white. She looked like a woman who was physically shrinking under the crushing weight of public exposure. As you can clearly see, I continued smoothly clicking a small remote hidden in my palm. The slide shifted instantly to a new document. A series of defaulted loan notices flashed across the screen. These are formal notices of default from 3 separate offshore lenders. The firm has not made a single legitimate interest payment in exactly 8 months. Instead of admitting insolvency, Richard and Bradley decided to keep up appearances. They continued taking capital from many of you sitting in this very room tonight. I pointed directly at a well-known venture capitalist who had just attended Bradley's bachelor party 2 weeks prior. They took your money to pay for their country club memberships, their imported cars, and the lease on their fake corporate office. They operated a textbook Ponzi scheme wrapped in a designer tuxedo. The outrage from the crowd was instantaneous and completely uncontained. Angry shouts erupted from the VIP tables. Guests slammed their fists down on the fine linen. Several high-profile investors began furiously dialing their legal teams on their cell phones, barking orders to freeze accounts and initiate emergency audits. The elite solidarity that the family had relied upon was entirely dead. The room had transformed into a den of betrayed, furious wolves. Bradley spun around to look at the screen. The blood completely drained from his face as he read the confidential documents being broadcast to his entire social and professional circle. He let out a strangled, desperate noise. He lunged toward the back of the stage, waving his arms frantically, trying to physically block the massive projector with his body. It was a pathetic, futile gesture. He was just a single man trying to cast a shadow over a 50-foot wall of truth. "Turn it off!" Bradley screamed at the sound booth, his voice cracking with pure panic. "Somebody turn that screen off right now. This is illegal. These are private documents." "They are evidence, Bradley." I corrected him, projecting my voice over his frantic shouting. "And since you tried to use my name and my supposed lack of status to cover up your crimes, I decided the most appropriate venue to reveal the truth was the very event you orchestrated to scam these people. You brought them all into one room. You just saved the federal investigators the trouble of rounding up the victims." Bradley practically threw himself at the base of the massive screen, his hands smacking against the digital glass as if he could manually wipe away the numbers. His tuxedo jacket was completely ruined with sweat. He looked out at the sea of angry faces, his breath hitching. He tried to form words, tried to spin another lie, but his voice completely failed him. The undeniable reality of his fraud was burning brightly behind him, casting long, dark shadows across the stage. He was a man watching his entire existence evaporate in real time. I clicked the remote again. The screen transitioned to a new set of bank statements. These displayed personal accounts linked directly to Patricia and Monica. "Let us not pretend the women of this family were innocent bystanders," I stated, making sure Monica heard every single word. The slide zoomed in on a series of exorbitant luxury purchases. While the firm was actively defaulting on millions of dollars in loans, Patricia was charging $80,000 in high-end jewelry to a corporate expense account. Monica was using investor capital to fund a month-long vacation in Monaco. They lived like royalty on stolen money. Monica let out a high-pitched wail. She grabbed her husband Jamal by the arm, trying to hide behind his broad shoulders. But Jamal was violently shrugging her off, stepping away from her, as if she were suddenly contagious. He was frantically trying to distance himself from the sinking ship. I watched them turn on each other, feeling nothing but cold satisfaction. The Golden family, who had spent the entire evening mocking my background and demanding my gratitude, was now publicly exposed as a syndicate of thieves. They had no honor, no wealth, and absolutely no way out. The undeniable proof was glaring down at them in stunning 4,000 pixel resolution, branding them as frauds for the rest of their lives. But the absolute worst of their financial crimes had not even been shown yet. They had stolen from their investors, yes. But Bradley had committed a far more personal, far more dangerous sin. I clicked the remote one more time, preparing to deliver the killing blow. The screen shifted away from Richard's failing firm and centered on a series of heavily encrypted wire transfers. It was time to show the audience exactly how Bradley had tried to save his doomed family, by targeting me. The digital display refreshed with a sharp, bright flash. Rows of banking data materialized, highlighting a complex web of offshore accounts and corporate routing numbers. I pointed my remote at the center of the screen, zooming in on 3 specific transactions executed over the last 72 hours. "Look closely at these routing numbers," I instructed the silent, captivated audience. "These are not standard corporate dividends or end-of-quarter payouts. These are panicked, desperate wire transfers." I walked to the edge of the stage, towering over Jamal, who was now trembling so violently his heavy gold watch rattled against his wrist. "You told me earlier that power up here is inherited and bought, Jamal. You lectured me about the rules of your elite world and how I was nothing but a low-level desk worker. But looking at these bank statements, it seems your power was actually just wired electronically from your brother-in-law." The screen shifted again, isolating a massive, undeniable figure in bright yellow highlight. $4.5 million. A collective gasp echoed across the ballroom. The crowd murmured in genuine shock. I traced the digital paper trail on the screen with my hand. The money started in a holding account controlled exclusively by Bradley. It was then funneled through 2 anonymous shell companies in the Cayman Islands to mask its origin. But the final destination was completely transparent. Every single cent was deposited directly into the primary operating account of Jamal's highly touted tech startup. Jamal stumbled backward, bumping hard into the edge of a banquet table. A silver fork clattered loudly to the floor. The venture capitalists sitting just feet away from him, the very men who had poured their own legitimate capital into his startup, stood up in unison. Their faces were twisted in pure rage. Jamal had pitched them a revolutionary technology company, promising massive returns and industry disruption. Now they were staring at undeniable proof that his prestigious business was nothing more than a glorified washing machine for his father-in-law's dirty money. "That is impossible," Jamal choked out, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his shaking hand. "I run a legitimate software enterprise. My valuation is real. I have proprietary algorithms." "Your valuation is a fantasy, Jamal." I shot back, my voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Your coding team consists of 3 interns working out of a rented basement workspace. You do not have a revolutionary algorithm. You have a routing number and a desperate family willing to use your corporate shell to launder stolen funds. You took Bradley's money to pay off the immediate interest on Richard's offshore gambling debts, desperately trying to keep the financial sharks at bay for just one more week." Monica spun around, her high heels catching on the carpet. She stared at the giant screen, then at her husband, her face a mask of genuine horror. "You told me we were getting Series A funding," Monica shrieked at Jamal, her voice breaking. "You told me we were rich. You brought federal financial crimes into my house." Jamal held his hands up defensively, backing away from his furious wife. "I did not know it was dirty," he pleaded, his voice cracking with fear. "Bradley swore it was clean capital. He told me it was an early wedding gift from his private accounts. I just signed the receiving paperwork. I swear I did not look at the origins of the transfers." Bradley let out a guttural sound from the stage floor. He scrambled to his feet, his tuxedo jacket completely ruined with sweat, though he kept a safe distance from me. "Shut up," Jamal Bradley yelled, pointing an accusing finger at his brother-in-law. "Do not play the innocent victim now. You begged me for cash when your server leases were about to be terminated." The audience was completely mesmerized by the spectacular implosion happening right in front of them. The sheer audacity of moving $4.5 million through a fake tech company just days before a high-profile wedding was staggering. The elite investors in the room were staring at the screen, their brilliant financial minds doing the math. The murmurs grew louder as the realization set in. If Richard's firm was bankrupt and Bradley's accounts were completely drained, where did $4.5 million suddenly come from? I raised the microphone again, cutting through the rising chaos in the ballroom. The room instantly fell silent, waiting eagerly for my next words. "You see, the guests in this room are incredibly smart men and women," Bradley, I announced, keeping my eyes locked on my husband. "They are looking at this massive wire transfer, and they are wondering the exact same thing I wondered when my private bank notified me of a massive security breach on my personal accounts. If your family is completely broke, how did you manage to wire $4.5 million to Jamal on a Tuesday afternoon?" Bradley froze. The remaining blood drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse in a tailored suit. He realized what I was about to say. He realized the ultimate devastating truth was about to be dropped on the entire room. He shook his head slowly, a silent, desperate plea for mercy that I had absolutely no intention of granting. I turned to face the crowd, holding my head high, preparing to deliver the killing blow that would seal his fate forever. I clicked the remote one final time. The screen behind me shifted from the offshore routing numbers to a highly classified, incredibly sensitive banking document. The logo of one of the most exclusive private wealth management firms in the world glowed in bright blue at the top of the screen. Beneath it was a transfer authorization form, filled out, dated just 3 days prior, and stamped with a digital seal of approval. I pointed to the top left corner of the document. "That is my personal private trust account," I stated, my voice echoing like thunder across the silent ballroom. "It is an account that I established a decade ago, built entirely from the profits of my real estate developments. It is an account that Bradley was never supposed to have access to." I zoomed in on the bottom right corner of the document. The image enlarged to show a signature. It looked like mine, but the curvature of the letters was rigid and forced. "You hired a private investigator to find out my true net worth, Bradley," I announced, turning to glare at him. "But you did not stop there. You used the wedding planning process to gain access to my personal identification documents." You waited until I was distracted with finalizing the catering menu and the floral arrangements, and you meticulously forged my signature on a transfer authorization. You deliberately bypassed the security protocols of a joint marital account by executing this fraud before we even walked down the aisle. You stole $4.5 million of my hard-earned money because you were too cowardly to admit your family was completely destitute. Bradley let out a hollow, agonizing gasp. He backed away, his hands gripping the sides of his head as if trying to physically block out my words. But stealing from your bride was not enough, I continued, mercilessly pressing the attack. You had to protect the family patriarch. I turned my attention to Richard, who was now slouched in his chair, staring blankly at the floor. I clicked the remote again. A new ledger appeared, cross-referencing the deposits into Jamal's tech startup with a series of massive payouts to an illegal offshore gambling syndicate based in Macau. Richard did not just lose his investment firm to bad market conditions, I announced to the room. He gambled it away. He lost millions of dollars belonging to the people in this room on private baccarat tables and underground sports betting. When the syndicates came to collect, Richard panicked. He begged his golden boy Bradley to fix it. So Bradley stole my money, funneled it into Jamal's fake software company, and laundered it out the back door as fabricated operational expenses to pay off the gambling debts before the bookies broke Richard's legs. The reaction from the crowd was no longer just shocked whispers. It was an eruption of pure, unfiltered fury. The wealthy elite in the audience had tolerated a lot of things, but discovering they had been directly scammed was the absolute limit. A prominent angel investor, a man who had personally written a $2 million check for Jamal's seed funding round, completely lost his temper. He grabbed a heavy crystal water pitcher from his table and hurled it directly at the stage. It smashed against the wooden floorboards, sending water and sharp shards of glass flying in every direction. "You fraudulent piece of garbage!" The investor roared, his face purple with rage. He lunged toward Jamal, pointing a trembling finger at the tech CEO. "You sat in my office last month and showed me fabricated user metrics. You told me my capital was going towards server expansion. You used my money to cover your father-in-law's gambling losses." Other investors immediately joined the assault. Chairs scraped violently against the floor as dozens of furious executives stood up. The ballroom dissolved into total anarchy. Men and women who usually hid their ruthlessness behind polite country club smiles were now shouting obscenities, demanding their money back, and threatening brutal legal action. Jamal scrambled backward, desperately trying to put distance between himself and the advancing mob of angry billionaires. He tripped over the legs of a fallen chair, crashing hard onto the carpet. He held his hands up, pleading for mercy, insisting he was just a pawn in Bradley's scheme. But the investors were not listening. They closed in, their voices overlapping in a deafening chorus of threats. At the family table, the situation was equally disastrous. 3 former business partners surrounded Richard, boxing him into his chair. One of them, a man whose pension fund had been entirely wiped out by Richard's firm, grabbed the lapels of Richard's tuxedo and hauled him halfway out of his seat. "You stole my retirement to play cards in Macau!" the man bellowed, spittle flying from his lips. "I will destroy you, Richard. I will take your house, I will take your cars, and I will make sure you rot in a federal penitentiary for the rest of your miserable life." Patricia shrieked, batting frantically at the man's hands, trying to protect her husband. "Get your hands off him," she cried out, her voice shrill and desperate. "Security! Where is security? We are being attacked!" I stood calmly on the stage, watching the absolute destruction of their fake empire. I did not call for the security guards to intervene. The men stationed at the base of the stage remained perfectly still, their backs to me, ensuring that no one from the furious crowd could reach the platform. They were protecting me, not my in-laws. The sheer volume of the yelling and the sound of breaking glass echoed through the luxurious ballroom. The beautiful white floral centerpieces were knocked to the floor and trampled under the expensive leather shoes of enraged creditors. The $200,000 wedding had transformed into a brutal high-stakes tribunal. Bradley was on his knees on the stage, completely paralyzed by the violent chaos erupting below him. He looked at his father being manhandled by former friends. He looked at Jamal cowering on the floor. Then he slowly turned his head and looked up at me. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with a profound, earth-shattering realization. He had brought a predator into his home disguised as prey, and now his entire bloodline was paying the ultimate price. Jamal could no longer handle the crushing pressure of the furious investors surrounding him. The illusion of his corporate dominance evaporated entirely. He scrambled backward from the advancing billionaires, kicking away the remnants of a broken chair, and pointed a trembling finger directly at the stage. "He lied to me!" Jamal shrieked, his voice echoing through the ballroom without any need for a microphone. "Bradley told me the money was clean. He is the one who forged the transfer documents. I just provided the corporate routing numbers. I had no idea he was stealing from his own wife to cover up gambling debts." Bradley snapped out of his paralyzed state. The betrayal from his brother-in-law ignited a furious, desperate rage. He scrambled to the very edge of the wooden stage, leaning over to spit vitriol down at Jamal. "You greedy coward," Bradley yelled, his voice cracking under the strain. "You took a 30% cut to wash that money through your servers. You knew exactly what you were doing. Your fake tech company was weeks away from total bankruptcy, and you begged me to save it. You gladly took that capital to keep playing the successful CEO." Monica, completely unhinged by the loss of her emerald green-clad dignity and the terrifying prospect of federal prison, launched herself at Jamal. She grabbed the lapels of his ruined $5,000 suit, shaking him violently. Her perfectly styled hair fell in messy strands across her tear-streaked face. "You promised me we were getting Series A funding!" Monica screamed, her face contorted with absolute rage. "You told me we were going to be billionaires. You told me I could book the vacation to Monaco because your algorithm was finally selling. You dragged federal financial crimes into my house. You ruined my life." Jamal shoved her away roughly, his own panic morphing into vicious hostility. "Your brother ruined your life, Monica. Your father ruined your life. They used my company to pay off mafia debts because your precious daddy could not stop gambling in offshore casinos. Do not you dare put this on me. You loved spending the stolen money just as much as your mother did." Down at the family table, the camera phones of the elite guests pivoted eagerly to capture the next phase of the meltdown. Patricia, who had spent decades meticulously cultivating the image of a perfect high society matriarch, completely lost her mind. The sheer humiliation of being exposed in front of her country club peers broke her final shred of sanity. She turned on Richard with a ferocity that made the surrounding creditors take a step back. "This is your fault," Patricia shrieked, slapping Richard hard across the chest with her manicured hand. "Your disgusting gambling addiction. Your secret trips to Macau. You destroyed our legacy. You destroyed my social standing. I spent 30 years building this family up to the top of the elite circle, and you threw it all away on card tables." Richard grabbed her wrists forcefully, pushing her hands down. His face was a dark, mottled purple twisted with humiliation and fury. "Your social standing!" Richard bellowed, his voice hoarse. "You spent $80,000 on jewelry while we were actively defaulting on massive loans. You maxed out every credit card we had just to pretend we were still rich. You pushed Bradley to marry Caroline as quickly as possible so you could keep playing the wealthy socialite. You are a parasite, Patricia. You bled us dry just to keep up appearances." The unified front of the Golden family was entirely dead. They were no longer the elite, untouchable aristocrats of Aspen. They were rats trapped on a sinking ship, violently tearing each other apart to find a single piece of driftwood. The loyalty they had weaponized against me all evening was proven to be nothing but a fragile transactional lie. The second the money vanished, their love for one another vanished with it. I stood perfectly still on the stage. I did not speak into the microphone. I did not move to intervene. I simply watched them self-destruct. The contrast between my absolute stillness and their frantic, animalistic panic was staggering. I had laid the trap, but I did not need to push them into it. Their own greed, arrogance, and inherent selfishness were doing all the heavy lifting. The ballroom was filled with the sounds of shattering glass, the clicking of cell phone cameras, and the overlapping screams of a family turning on its own blood. Bradley was weeping openly on the edge of the stage, hurling insults at his sister. Monica was sobbing on the carpet, trading vicious verbal blows with Jamal. Richard and Patricia were verbally eviscerating decades of their marriage, loudly exposing every dark, ugly secret they had kept hidden behind their mansion doors. The wealthy investors who had previously treated them with respect were now laughing, recording the meltdown and sending the footage to every major financial contact in their networks. The family was executing their own social and professional death sentences live on camera. I watched the empire burn to the ground, feeling an overwhelming sense of vindication. I did not owe these people a single ounce of mercy. I just had to stand back and let the fire they started consume them entirely. The flames of their destruction were instantly captured by a sea of glowing rectangular screens. Hundreds of smartphones were raised high above the crowd, their camera lenses focused sharply on the grotesque display of a once powerful family tearing itself apart. The elite guests, disgusted and out for their own money, had seamlessly transitioned from outraged victims to ruthless paparazzi. In the world of high society, there is no currency more valuable than the catastrophic failure of a peer, and the guests were eagerly hoarding every single second of it. The flashes of cell phone cameras strobed across the darkened ballroom like lightning in a severe storm. Live streams were initiated across various social media platforms. Videos were being sent directly to private group chats, rival investment firms, and exclusive country club mailing lists. The very people Patricia and Richard had spent their entire lives trying to impress were now actively broadcasting their ruin to the entire world. I watched a prominent socialite, a woman Patricia frequently hosted for afternoon tea, standing on a chair to get a better angle of the carnage. She was narrating the event into her phone with a look of pure, unadulterated glee. This was the modern execution of a dynasty. It was bloodless, but it was absolutely lethal. The harsh glare of the camera lights finally broke through the blinding rage consuming Patricia and Richard. They stopped screaming at each other, the reality of the digital firing squad suddenly registering in their frantic eyes. Patricia gasped, her hands flying up to cover her tear-streaked, flushed face. She grabbed a discarded wine-stained linen napkin from the floor and held it desperately over her head, shrinking away from the relentless lenses. She whimpered, realizing that by tomorrow morning, she would be completely expelled from every charity board, gala committee, and elite circle she had clawed her way into. Her reputation was permanently vaporized. She was no longer a wealthy matriarch, she was a national joke. The country club memberships, the exclusive reservations, the superficial respect she had demanded from everyone around her were all gone in a matter of minutes. Richard tried to salvage whatever microscopic shred of dignity he had left. He stood up straight, smoothing down the lapels of his rumpled tuxedo, and pointed a shaking finger at the crowd. "Turn those cameras off," Richard bellowed, his voice hoarse and pathetic. "I demand you stop recording my family. This is a private event. You are violating our privacy. Put your phones away right now." His commands were met with cruel, mocking laughter. Nobody lowered their devices. A young hedge fund manager in the front row scoffed loudly. "You lost the right to privacy when you stole our money to play blackjack," Richard the manager shouted back. "Smile for the camera. The federal authorities are going to love this footage." Richard visibly deflated, his shoulders slumping as the last ounce of his patriarchal authority evaporated into the cold aspen air. He raised his hands to shield his face from the blinding camera flashes, turning away from the crowd and retreating into the shadows of the banquet table. He bumped into Monica, who was violently swatting away a smartphone thrust too close to her face by an angry creditor. The entire family was trapped in a digital fishbowl, unable to hide from the permanent documentation of their crimes. The sheer volume of the recording devices created a wall of bright, blinding light that trapped the family in the center of the room. Bradley, who was still kneeling on the edge of the wooden stage, slowly turned his head to take in the absolute devastation. He looked at his father, a broken, humiliated old man, hiding his face in shame. He looked at his mother, weeping under a soiled napkin, entirely stripped of her haughty elegance. He looked at his sister and brother-in-law sitting on the floor, surrounded by shattered glass and ruined floral arrangements, completely defeated by the angry mob of investors. Bradley slowly surveyed the exits. His chest heaved as a fresh wave of panic flooded his veins. The main double doors were completely blocked by a wall of furious creditors demanding their money back. The side service doors were manned by my imposing security team. Their arms crossed, their expressions stern and unforgiving. There was absolutely no physical escape from the ballroom. Furthermore, there was no financial escape waiting for him outside these walls. The shell companies were exposed, the bank accounts were empty, and the elite society that had always shielded him had locked him out forever. He was completely and utterly cornered. He had played a high-stakes game of deception, betting his entire existence on his ability to manipulate a woman he severely underestimated, and he had lost everything. The glamorous life he had envisioned, built on the stolen foundation of my private trust, had shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. His breathing became shallow and erratic. The claustrophobia of the flashing lights and the angry shouting pressed down on him, freezing him in place. With nowhere left to run and no one left to hide behind, Bradley slowly dragged his gaze away from the sea of glowing camera phones. He turned his head and looked up. His bloodshot, terrified eyes locked onto mine. I stood above him on the stage, the untouchable architect of his downfall, the only person in the entire building who held a single shred of power. He finally realized that the woman he tried to destroy was the only one who could stop the bleeding. Bradley did not just lower himself, he completely collapsed. The polished, confident investment director who had stood at the altar with me just hours ago was gone. In his place was a terrified, sniveling shell of a man. He dragged himself across the last few feet of the wooden stage, his expensive tuxedo pants scraping against the floorboards. When he reached my feet, he did not hesitate. He threw his arms forward and buried his face into the heavy silk folds of my wedding gown, wrapping his shaking hands tightly around the fabric. His fingers dug directly into the dark, sticky stain of the red wine Monica had thrown at me. "Caroline, I am begging you," Bradley sobbed. His voice was muffled against my dress, wet and pathetic. "Please, you have to stop this. You have made your point. You destroyed the firm. You ruined my parents. Everyone knows. Just turn off the screen and call off the lawyers. I will do anything you want. I will sign whatever you put in front of me. Just do not send us to federal prison." I looked down at the top of his perfectly styled hair, now ruined and plastered to his forehead with sweat. I did not step back. I let him cling to me. I wanted every single camera phone in the ballroom to capture this exact image. I wanted the elite investors to see the so-called golden boy of Aspen crying on his knees, clutching the dress of the woman his family had mocked all night. When his initial pleading did not elicit a response from me, Bradley shifted his tactics. He lifted his head, revealing eyes red and swollen with genuine panic. He looked up at me, trying to summon the charming, boyish vulnerability that had tricked me 2 years ago. He was attempting to weaponize our relationship, hoping to find a hidden reservoir of affection he could exploit. "We are husband and wife," Caroline Bradley pleaded, his voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "We stood in front of an altar today and promised to love each other for better or for worse. This is the worst part. I made a terrible mistake. I know I messed up, but I only stole that money because I was trying to protect our future. My father was going to drag me down with him. The bookies were threatening my life. I forged that transfer because I wanted to save our family before we even started one. I did it for us." The sheer audacity of his lie was staggering. He was actually trying to frame a $4.5 million wire fraud as an act of romantic devotion. He wanted me to believe that draining my private trust was his twisted way of protecting our marriage. "I loved you, Caroline," Bradley cried, his grip tightening on my ruined dress. "I still love you. Remember the night I proposed? Remember what we talked about? We were going to build a life together. You cannot just throw all of that away because of money. You are a good person. You have a kind heart. You are not a monster like these people in the crowd. Do not let vengeance turn you into someone cold and ruthless. Forgive me. Please, just forgive me and help me fix this." He was laying it on thick, using every manipulative buzzword in the book. He called me a good person, hoping to guilt-trip me into submission. He invoked our engagement, hoping nostalgia would blind me to his crimes. He even tried to separate me from the angry investors, below acting as if we were a united front against a cruel world, completely ignoring the fact that he was the one who had robbed both me and them. I stared down at his tear-streaked face. I felt absolutely nothing. The love I once held for this man had evaporated the exact second he told me to smile while his mother called me a charity case. "You do not get to use the word love, Bradley," I said. My voice was incredibly calm, dropping to a tone so icy it made him flinch. Love does not hire a private investigator to dig into a woman's background before buying an engagement ring. Love does not stand by silently while a mother verbally abuses a bride on her wedding day. Love does not forge a signature to steal millions of dollars to pay off illegal gambling debts. Bradley opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off instantly. "You did not steal that money for us." I continued, speaking clearly into the microphone so the entire ballroom could hear his pathetic excuses. "You stole it because you are a coward. You were too afraid to lose your country club memberships and your imported cars. You looked at me and you saw a bank account. You thought my quiet demeanor meant I was weak. You thought you could rob me blind and I would just smile and thank you for the privilege of carrying your last name." He shook his head frantically, fresh tears spilling down his cheeks. "No, Caroline, that is not true. I swear to you. I was desperate. I was scared." "You should be scared, Bradley," I replied, my voice devoid of a single ounce of mercy. "Because your desperation does not excuse your felony. You think invoking our wedding vows will save you. You broke those vows before you even said them. You built this entire marriage on a foundation of fraud, and now you are crying because the bill has finally come due." I firmly reached down and grabbed his wrists. My grip was unyielding. I peeled his sweaty, shaking hands off the fabric of my wedding dress. He tried to hold on, but he had absolutely zero strength left. I pushed his hands away, stepping back so he was left kneeling on the bare wooden floorboards, completely untethered from me. "You want me to stop the presentation?" I asked, looking down at his defeated, crumbling posture. "You want me to call off the lawyers and save your family from federal prison?" Bradley nodded eagerly, a pathetic glimmer of hope sparking in his desperate eyes. "Yes. Please, Caroline. I will do anything." I smiled. It was a sharp, clinical smile that contained absolutely zero warmth. I reached into the hidden pocket sewn seamlessly into the side of my wedding gown. It was time to show him that I had never planned on stopping with just a presentation. I kept my hand inside the concealed pocket of my custom silk gown. Bradley watched my movement with wide, desperate eyes. He actually thought I was going to pull out a handkerchief for his tears, or perhaps a phone to call off my security team. His delusion was almost fascinating to witness. I withdrew a perfectly folded, thick stack of legal documents. At the exact same moment, Mr. Bennett stepped forward from the shadows of the stage wing and handed me a pristine black leather portfolio to serve as a hard surface. I unfolded the heavy parchment paper and stared down at the man kneeling at my feet. "Bradley," I said, my voice projecting across the silent ballroom. "You asked me to call off the lawyers. You said you would sign whatever I put in front of you. I am going to hold you to that promise right now." I let the heavy stack of legal documents slip from my fingers. They fell through the air and landed squarely against Bradley's chest with a muffled thud. He instinctively scrambled to catch them, his shaking hands clutching the crisp white pages against his ruined tuxedo shirt. His eyes darted down to read the bold black lettering printed across the very first page. "Those are your divorce papers," I announced, ensuring every single guest heard the finality in my tone. "I had them drafted the exact day my private bank notified me of your fraudulent wire transfer. I signed them this morning before I even put on this wedding dress. Our marriage is legally over before the catering staff even had a chance to serve the wedding cake." Bradley stared at the word divorce, printed at the top of the page. His jaw trembled, but he could not form a coherent sentence. He flipped frantically to the second page and then the third, his breathing turning into rapid, shallow gasps. He was searching for a loophole, a mistake, a technicality he could exploit. But there were none. My legal team was the best in the country, and they had executed my orders with absolute precision. "Keep reading, Bradley," I instructed coldly. Right behind the divorce decree is a judicial asset freeze order signed directly by a federal judge. It legally locks every single asset tied to your name, your father's fraudulent investment firm, and Jamal's fake tech startup. It freezes your offshore routing accounts, your domestic checking accounts, and the shell companies you set up in the Cayman Islands. As of this exact second, you do not have a single dime left to your name. You cannot buy a plane ticket. You cannot hire a defense attorney. You cannot even afford to buy a cup of coffee. Down on the ballroom floor, Richard let out a choked, devastated groan. Patricia buried her face in her hands, realizing that their stolen wealth was permanently sealed away. Monica was weeping hysterically, clutching Jamal's arm, but Jamal was completely catatonic. The tech CEO was staring blankly at the stage, calculating the exact number of years he was about to spend in a federal penitentiary for money laundering. The sheer magnitude of their sudden absolute poverty was crushing the air out of their lungs. Bradley dropped the legal papers onto the wooden stage. They scattered around his knees, mixing with the sharp shards of crystal from the glass Monica had shattered earlier. He looked up at me, his face completely devoid of color. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows waiting for the lever to be pulled. The arrogant investment director who had confidently commanded me to smile for his VIP partners was utterly gone. "You froze everything," Bradley whispered. His voice was incredibly weak, barely audible even without the microphone. "Caroline, how did you get a federal judge to sign an asset freeze on a Saturday? You cannot do this without a criminal investigation." I smiled. It was the same cold, calculating smile I reserved for ruthless corporate predators who tried to back me into a corner. I brought the microphone close to my lips, ready to deliver the absolute final nail in his coffin. "You are incredibly observant, Bradley," I said, my voice ringing out with crystal-clear precision. "A federal judge does indeed require a formal criminal investigation to authorize a complete asset freeze of this magnitude. Which brings me to the final piece of business for tonight." I turned my gaze away from my kneeling husband and looked out over the sea of wealthy investors, venture capitalists, and high society guests. The entire room was holding its collective breath. The men and women who had been scammed by the Golden family stood motionless, their phones still raised, recording every single second of the spectacle. "I did not just show these financial slides to our guests tonight," I announced. Every word landed like a hammer strike in the quiet ballroom. "I did not just gather you all here to publicly expose your bankruptcy and your wire fraud. I am not interested in simply humiliating you in front of your country club peers." Bradley slowly shook his head, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated terror. He finally realized the true scale of the trap he had walked into. He raised a shaking hand as if he could physically stop the words from leaving my mouth. "I submitted the full, unredacted forensic audit to the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office at exactly 6 o'clock this morning," I declared. "I handed over the forged wire transfers, the offshore routing numbers, the communications between you and Jamal, and the complete financial history of Richard's gambling syndicate directly to federal agents." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of total destruction. I had not just ruined their reputation. I had handed them over to the federal government. I had legally, financially, and socially annihilated them, and I had done it all without ever breaking a sweat. The profound silence in the ballroom lasted only a fraction of a second. It was broken by a sound that started as a distant, high-pitched wail echoing off the snow-capped Aspen Mountains. The sound multiplied, growing louder and more aggressive by the millisecond, piercing straight through the thick, insulated glass of the resort. Then came the lights. Brilliant, blinding flashes of red and blue erupted outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. The emergency lights strobed violently through the sheer curtains, casting a chaotic, rapid-fire glow across the luxurious ballroom. The colors bounced off the crystal chandeliers and the silver cutlery, transforming the opulent wedding reception into a glaring, inescapable crime scene. The entire room was bathed in the unmistakable, terrifying glow of law enforcement. The elite guests, billionaires, venture capitalists, and hedge fund managers reacted with the immediate, ruthless instinct of the ultra-wealthy. They knew exactly what those lights meant, and they knew exactly how radioactive this situation had just become. Nobody wanted to be caught on camera, or questioned by federal agents in connection with a massive wire fraud scheme. A mass exodus began instantly. Chairs scraped loudly against the polished wood floor as guests shoved away from their banquet tables. They grabbed their expensive coats and designer clutches, physically backing away from the front of the room. They created a massive empty perimeter around the family table, leaving Richard, Patricia, Monica, and Jamal entirely isolated in the center of the room. The social abandonment was absolute. They were no longer the hosts of the year. They were highly contagious pariahs. At the family table, sheer, unadulterated panic took over. Richard jumped to his feet, his chair crashing backward to the floor. He spun around, his eyes wild and bloodshot, searching frantically for a way out. He looked toward the kitchen service doors, fully intending to abandon his wife and children to save his own skin. But he stopped dead in his tracks. Mr. Bennett's private security team had already anticipated the move. 4 massive guards in dark suits stood shoulder to shoulder across the exit, their arms folded, completely blocking any chance of escape. Richard was boxed in. Patricia lost whatever microscopic shred of sanity she had left. She grabbed Richard by the lapels of his tuxedo, shaking him violently. "Do something!" Patricia shrieked, her voice cracking into a hysterical, jagged sob. "Call your lawyers. Call the governor. You cannot let them do this to us. I cannot go to prison. I will not survive in a prison." Richard shoved her hands away roughly, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. "Shut your mouth, Patricia," he hissed, his voice trembling with sheer terror. "Do not say a single word to anyone." Monica was hyperventilating, her chest heaving as she stumbled backward away from the table. She looked at Jamal, expecting her tech CEO husband to somehow fix the situation. But Jamal was paralyzed. He stared at the flashing red and blue lights, painting the walls of the ballroom, doing the mental math on exactly how many decades of federal money laundering conviction carried. He took a staggering step backward, actively putting distance between himself and the rest of his in-laws. "I did not know," Jamal shouted, his voice cracking as he looked desperately at the retreating crowd of investors. "I am innocent. Bradley forged the paperwork. I am just a victim of his fraud." Nobody listened to him. The wail of the sirens outside abruptly cut off, replaced by the loud, heavy slamming of car doors and the sharp commands of law enforcement personnel echoing through the resort lobby. On the stage, Bradley was still kneeling on the floorboards among the scattered divorce papers and the frozen asset orders. He looked like a man who had just been struck by lightning. He slowly turned his head to look at me, his eyes wide and completely hollow. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer one last pathetic plea for mercy, but the words died in his throat. The heavy, ornate double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom burst open with a deafening crash. A dozen federal agents swarmed into the room. They moved with terrifying, coordinated precision, wearing dark tactical windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI stamped boldly across their backs and chests. Their badges gleamed under the strobe of the emergency lights filtering through the windows. The sharp, heavy thud of their boots on the hardwood floor sounded like a military drumbeat, silencing every single whisper in the room. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern, unforgiving expression, marched straight down the center aisle. He did not look at the elite guests cowering near the walls. He locked his eyes directly on the family table in the center of the room. "Federal agents, nobody move!" The lead agent bellowed. His voice was an absolute roar, commanding total compliance. "We are executing federal arrest warrants for Richard, Bradley, and Jamal." The words echoed off the vaulted ceiling, sealing their fate. The agents fanned out rapidly, cutting off every possible angle of escape. 2 agents broke away from the main group and headed straight for the stage, their eyes locked on Bradley. 3 more agents surrounded the family table, stepping right over the crushed white orchids and the spilled champagne. "You are all under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and bank fraud," the lead agent announced, pulling a thick stack of folded warrants from his jacket pocket. "Keep your hands where we can see them. Any sudden movements will be considered resisting arrest." Patricia let out a guttural, horrifying scream. She dropped to her knees, clutching her head, sobbing so violently her entire body shook. Richard raised his trembling hands in the air, his face completely devoid of color, surrendering without a fight. He knew the game was over. The offshore accounts were frozen, the gambling debts were exposed, and the federal government had all the receipts. Jamal tried to run. He spun around and took exactly 2 steps toward the back of the room before a federal agent grabbed him by the shoulder of his $5,000 bespoke suit and shoved him hard against a structural pillar. Jamal yelled out in panic, claiming he was set up, claiming he was just an innocent tech developer, but the agent simply pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. Up on the stage, the 2 agents reached Bradley. He did not try to run. He did not try to fight. He stayed on his knees, his head hanging low in absolute crushing defeat. The agents grabbed him by the arms, hauled him roughly to his feet, and twisted his hands behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut over his wrists echoed clearly over the open microphone I still held in my hand. I stood perfectly still, watching the entire operation unfold with cold, calculated satisfaction. I did not flinch as the agents marched past me. I did not look away as the men who had plotted to steal my entire fortune were stripped of their freedom, their dignity, and their future. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the absolute wreckage of their lives, providing the perfect lighting for the final act of this spectacular downfall. The blinding barrage of camera flashes hit the Golden family like a wave of physical blows. The elite investors and high society guests had closed in, forming a tight, inescapable ring around the center of the ballroom. They held their smartphones high, ensuring that every angle of the arrests was being captured in high definition. The relentless clicking of camera shutters and the harsh glare of the recording lights pushed the family past the brink of mere panic. It triggered a hysterical, animalistic flight response. Patricia broke first. The reality of being photographed in handcuffs by the very women she had spent decades trying to socially dominate completely fractured her mind. She let out a wild, high-pitched shriek, throwing her hands over her face to block the blinding lenses. Desperate to escape the digital execution, she dropped to her hands and knees, right there on the polished hardwood floor. Ignoring her ruined couture gown, she frantically crawled toward the massive family banquet table. She shoved aside an overturned chair, ducked her head, and scurried straight under the heavy, imported silk tablecloth, plunging herself into the dark hiding space beneath. Seeing her mother retreat into the shadows, Monica completely abandoned any remaining shred of her pride. She shrieked, kicking off her expensive high heels, and dove onto the floor right after Patricia. Her emerald green bridesmaid dress bunched up around her waist as she scrambled under the table on all fours, sobbing hysterically to escape the unyielding glare of the cameras. Richard, the once proud patriarch of the family, could no longer handle the vicious taunts from his former business partners. A hedge fund manager shouted another insult about his gambling debts, shoving a recording phone directly into Richard's personal space. Stripped of all dignity and terrified of having his mugshot broadcast across the financial networks, Richard slumped downward. He dropped to his knees, burying his face in his hands, and crawled awkwardly under the drooping silk fabric to join his wife and daughter. Jamal used the sudden chaotic movement to his advantage. The federal agent holding him against the structural pillar was momentarily distracted by the family dropping to the floor. With a burst of panicked adrenaline, Jamal twisted his shoulder hard, slipping out of the agent's grip. He did not try to run for the exit. He knew the doors were heavily guarded. Instead, the disgraced tech CEO dropped to the carpet and slid frantically under the banquet table, desperate to hide his face from the investors he had scammed. Up on the stage, Bradley was already handcuffed, his arms secured tightly behind his back. He watched his entire family vanish beneath the banquet table, cowering like terrified animals. The cameras immediately swiveled toward him, capturing his sweaty, ruined appearance. The shame was absolute and entirely suffocating. Unable to use his hands, Bradley awkwardly shimmied his way to the edge of the low wooden stage. He dropped his legs over the side, slid down to the floor, and literally wormed his way across the carpet. Using his shoulders and knees, he rolled himself underneath the draped linen, hiding in the dark alongside the rest of his ruined bloodline. Once they were all huddled together beneath the table, Patricia reached up and violently yanked the edges of the silk tablecloth downward. She pulled the heavy fabric completely over their heads in a futile attempt to seal them off from the outside world. Her frantic pulling caused a disaster on the tabletop above them. The expensive crystal wine glasses, the heavy silver cutlery, and the massive white floral centerpieces were dragged over the edge. The items crashed down around them, raining water-crushed orchids and shattered glass onto their cowering bodies. But they did not care. They simply huddled closer together in the cramped dark space among the table legs and discarded napkins, weeping and shivering in absolute disgrace. It was the ultimate humiliation. The most elite, arrogant family in Aspen was now a pathetic, trembling mass of bodies hiding under a piece of fabric, desperately pretending the consequences of their felony crimes could not reach them. The federal agents stood around the perimeter of the table, momentarily stunned by the sheer staggering absurdity of the display. Even the furious investors lowered their phones for a brief second, openly laughing at the pathetic spectacle of 5 adults cowering under a banquet table. I stood on the stage looking down at the lumpy, shaking shape of the tablecloth. I felt no pity. This was the exact destination their arrogance and greed had always been leading them toward. "We are not playing hide-and-seek the lead," federal agent barked, his voice laced with heavy disgust. "Get out from under the table right now with your hands visible." Nobody moved. Muffled, frantic sobbing echoed from beneath the silk fabric. Patricia was audibly hyperventilating while Bradley was begging his father to do something to fix it. They were completely paralyzed by their own cowardice. "Agents, secure the subjects," the lead agent ordered sharply. 6 federal agents stepped forward in total unison, their heavy black boots coming to a stop just inches from the edge of the silk cloth. On the count of 3, the agents grabbed the thick edges of the imported tablecloth. With one violent, synchronized upward yank, they ripped the massive fabric completely off the table and tossed it aside. The illusion of safety was instantly obliterated. The bright, unforgiving light of the crystal chandeliers and the harsh strobes of the emergency vehicles flooded their hiding spot. The elite cameras immediately zoomed in, capturing the ultimate pathetic tableau. Patricia, Richard, Monica, Jamal, and Bradley were tangled together on the carpet, covered in spilled water and crushed flowers, shielding their eyes from the blinding exposure. "Drag them up," the lead agent commanded. The agents moved in without a single ounce of hesitation. 2 agents grabbed Richard by his armpits, hauling the heavy, groaning patriarch to his feet and slamming him against the edge of the bare table to secure his handcuffs. Patricia shrieked wildly as an agent grabbed her by the arm, dragging her upright. Her hair was a tangled mess, her face streaked with ruined makeup, her couture gown soaked in dirty water. Monica thrashed her legs, kicking wildly at the carpet and screaming that she was a victim, but a female agent efficiently secured her wrists and pulled her to a standing position. Jamal tried to keep his head tucked between his knees, crying openly about his ruined startup. But the agents hauled him up by the collar of his custom suit, forcing him to face the very investors he had defrauded. Finally, an agent reached down and grabbed Bradley by the back of his tuxedo jacket. Since Bradley was already handcuffed, the agent simply hauled him upward, dragging him to his feet like a lifeless rag doll. Bradley went completely limp, his chin resting against his chest, refusing to look at the cameras, his family, or me. He had been dragged out of the dark and thrust directly into the blazing light of justice, completely stripped of his dignity, his wealth, and his freedom. I stood on the elevated platform, observing the complete and total subjugation of the people who had tried to destroy me. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated their tear-streaked, devastated faces, painting a portrait of absolute defeat. They had wanted to make me a spectacle. They had wanted to showcase their supposed superiority and highlight my fabricated inadequacies. Now they were the spectacle permanently recorded in the annals of high society disgrace. I raised my left hand, letting the heavy, brilliant cut diamond engagement ring catch the harsh glare of the camera flashes. Bradley saw the movement. Even through his fog of terror and humiliation, his eyes locked onto the piece of jewelry he had purchased with stolen money. It was the ultimate symbol of his deception, the glittering bait he had used to lure me into his financial slaughterhouse. With deliberate, unhurried precision, I grasped the platinum band with my right thumb and forefinger. I did not struggle. I did not hesitate. I smoothly slid the ring over my knuckle and held it out over the wooden floorboards of the stage. I opened my fingers. The heavy diamond plummeted. It hit the stage with a sharp, resonant clink that somehow cut through the chaotic noise of the ballroom. It bounced once, rolled a few inches, and came to a dead stop, right at the edge of the platform, mere feet from where Bradley was being restrained by federal agents. He stared at the discarded ring, his chest heaving with ragged, defeated sobs. He finally understood that every single tie binding me to his miserable existence had been permanently severed. Madam Chairman. The calm, deeply respectful voice of Mr. Bennet broke through the intense focus of the moment. I turned away from the pathetic display on the floor to find my head resort manager standing beside me. He held a magnificent floor-length coat made of the finest midnight black cashmere. The garment was lined with plush silk and exuded an aura of untouchable luxury. "Allow me," he offered, stepping behind me. I nodded once. Mr. Bennet lifted the heavy coat and draped it perfectly over my shoulders. The luxurious cashmere completely covered the dark, ruined bodice of my wedding gown. It hid the vicious red wine stain Monica had hurled at me in her arrogant rage. The coat felt like royal armor, shielding me from the bitter cold of the mountain air and the toxic residue of the family I was leaving behind. I slipped my arms into the sleeves and pulled the lapels tight against my chest. The transition was instant and visually striking. I was no longer the humiliated bride in a ruined dress. I was the undisputed titan of my industry, stepping back into the immense power I had built with my own two hands. "Your vehicle is secured and waiting at the main entrance," Mr. Bennet informed me, his posture impeccable. "My security team has cleared a direct path for you." "Thank you for your excellent service tonight," I replied, my voice steady and filled with genuine appreciation. "Please ensure the authorities have full access to any resort security footage they require for their investigation." "Absolutely, Madam Chairman." I turned my back on the stage, the massive LED screen, and the shattered remnants of my wedding reception. I walked toward the front stairs of the platform and descended with measured, elegant steps. The aisle that had been painstakingly decorated with expensive white floral arrangements and imported silk runners was now a chaotic pathway of destruction. But as I stepped onto the plush carpet, the wealthy guests instantly parted. The venture capitalists, the hedge fund managers, and the elite socialites physically stepped back, pressing themselves against the banquet tables to give me a wide, unobstructed path. They lowered their smartphones. The mocking laughter and angry shouting faded into a low, respectful murmur as I passed. They were looking at me not with the morbid curiosity they had shown earlier, but with absolute, unadulterated awe. I had orchestrated a masterclass in corporate and legal warfare, and I had executed it flawlessly. As I walked gracefully down the center of the ballroom, the authoritative voices of the federal agents rose above the remaining noise. The synchronization was almost poetic. "Richard, Patricia, Bradley, Monica, and Jamal, you have the right to remain silent," the lead agent announced loudly, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Patricia let out another agonizing, high-pitched wail, begging the agents to let her call her country club attorney. Monica shrieked at Jamal, blaming him for dragging her into a federal indictment. Bradley just wept, completely broken, muttering useless apologies to a room full of people who only wanted to see him locked behind bars. "You have the right to an attorney?" Another agent continued, forcefully guiding Jamal toward the main exit. "If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." Given the absolute zero balance of their frozen assets, they were definitely going to need those public defenders. I kept my chin held high and my eyes focused straight ahead. I did not turn my head to look at them one last time. I did not offer a final triumphant smirk. They were entirely beneath my notice. They were no longer a threat, a family, or a concern. They were simply criminals being processed by the justice system. I pushed through the heavy wooden double doors of the grand ballroom and stepped out into the expansive marble-floored lobby of the resort. The silence out here was jarring compared to the battlefield I had just left. My private security detail flanked me immediately, matching my brisk, confident pace as we walked toward the main entrance. The automatic glass doors slid open. allowing the crisp, freezing air of the Aspen Mountains to wash over my face. The scent of pine and fresh snow was incredibly grounding. The chaotic strobe lights of the federal vehicles painted the snowy driveway in frantic colors, but my attention was completely focused on the sleek black limousine idling quietly at the edge of the roundabout. My personal driver stood at attention by the rear passenger door. He opened it swiftly as I approached, bowing his head in quiet respect. I paused for a fraction of a second before stepping inside. I took one deep, revitalizing breath of the freezing mountain air. The suffocating weight of Bradley's lies, Patricia's elitist cruelty, and the entire toxic charade of the Golden family was entirely gone. I had protected my empire, defended my dignity, and sent the predators who tried to consume me straight into a concrete cage. I gathered the heavy cashmere coat around myself and slid into the luxurious leather interior of the limousine. The driver closed the door with a solid, satisfying thud, sealing me inside a quiet sanctuary of safety and wealth. "Take me home," I instructed the driver. The engine purred to life and the limousine glided smoothly away from the flashing red and blue lights of the resort entrance. I leaned back against the plush leather seat and watched the snowy mountain landscape roll past the tinted windows. I was entirely alone, and I had never felt more victorious, independent, and completely free. Caroline's story teaches a profound lesson about the true nature of power and self-worth. It proves that our value is never dictated by the approval of toxic individuals who view us through a lens of prejudice. True strength lies in forging our independence and fiercely holding our ground when manipulators try to diminish us. Caroline reclaimed her dignity not with tears, but by exposing the fraudulent facade of her abusers. Never let anyone trample your boundaries or make you feel small to feed their ego. Share your stories of overcoming toxic relationships and let me know in the comments below.